It is often said that geography is destiny, but in the case of the North American continent, destiny has long been shaped not merely by the physical landscape, but by a shared, if occasionally asymmetrical, civility. For nearly 2 centuries, the border stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific has stood not as a barrier of hostility, but as a monument to a remarkable geopolitical axiom that two great nations, distinct in their histories and constitutional temperaments, could coexist in a state of perpetually unguarded friendship. This relationship, often taken for granted in the bustle of daily commerce and cross-border traffic, is now facing an existential interrogation that few observers have fully grasped. You might have seen the headlines recently. They are chaotic, filled with the noise of distant thunder, missile strikes in Nigeria, naval maneuvers near Venezuelan tankers, and the curious, almost retrograde revival of the idea that the United States might simply purchase Greenland as if it were a distressed asset in a real estate portfolio. On the surface, these events appear to be the scattered, impulsive actions of an administration committed to a muscular, if erratic, reassertion of American power on the global stage. But if you look closer, if you strip away the bluster of the daily news cycle, a more disturbing narrative emerges, one that places our oldest and most stable ally directly in the crosshairs. The true story here is not about Greenland or Nigeria. It is about Canada and the alarming possibility that the logic of conquest, seemingly banished to the history books of the 19th century, is being dusted off and repurposed for the 21st. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must look past the smoke of the immediate controversies. The recent reports elucidated by analysts like Eric Ham suggest a pattern that is as strategic as it is unsettling. We are witnessing the weaponization of what has been termed economic force, a bludgeon designed to bend sovereign nations to the will of Washington. The administration's overtures regarding the acquisition of Greenland and the deployment of military assets in the global south are not merely isolated displays of strength. They are signals. They establish a precedent that sovereignty is negotiable, that the independence of nations is contingent upon their utility to the United States, and that the boundaries on the map are less rigid than we assumed, and now that gaze is turned north. The suggestion, once dismissed as the jest of a showman, that Canada itself could be absorbed or taken through economic strangulation, is being treated with a renewed and chilling seriousness in the corridors of power. This is not merely a dispute over dairy quotas or lumber tariffs. It is a fundamental challenge to the Westphalian system of states applied to a neighbor that has been a paragon of order, good government, and reliable partnership. Consider for a moment the absurdity and indeed the tragedy of this proposition. Canada is not a failed state requiring intervention, nor is it a hostile power threatening our shores. It is in many respects the mirror in which we see a calmer, more orderly reflection of our own democratic aspirations. To view this sovereign nation, a G7 economy, a NATO ally, a country that stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States through the darkest conflicts of the 20th century as a target for annexation or economic subjugation, is a profound betrayal of the values the United States claims to champion. It suggests a retreat from the role of leader of the free world to that of a predatory hegemon willing to cannibalize its closest friends for the sake of a nationalist sugar rush. The mechanism for this pressure is the renegotiation of CUSMA, the trade agreement that binds our economies. But let us be clear, when the president signals a willingness to walk away from this deal, when tariffs are brandished not as instruments of trade policy, but as weapons of coercion, we have left the realm of economics and entered the dangerous territory of imperial ambition. The institutions that govern international relations rely on trust, the coin of the realm in diplomacy. That trust is eroding. When we hear of missile strikes in Nigeria and envoys for Greenland, we are watching the dismantling of the norms that keep the world stable. And for you, the viewer, this matters deeply. It matters because the stability of your economy, the safety of your borders, and the moral standing of your nation are inextricably linked to how we treat our neighbors. If the United States can turn upon Canada, a nation that essentially defines the concept of a good neighbor, then no alliance is safe, and the world becomes a much darker, more unpredictable place. We are drifting toward a scenario where might makes right, where the art of the deal replaces the rule of law, and where the peaceful coexistence of sovereign democracies is treated as an inefficiency to be corrected rather than a triumph to be preserved. This aggression against Canada is particularly jarring because it misreads the character of the Canadian people and the resilience of their institutions. Canada's identity is forged in the fires of negotiation, compromise, and a fierce, quiet pride in their distinctiveness from the American experiment. To think they will simply fold under the pressure of tariffs or the threat of economic force is a miscalculation of historic proportions. It ignores the spine of steel that runs through the Canadian body politic. As we move through this analysis, we must recognize that we are not just talking about trade flows or GDP. We are talking about the soul of the North American continent. We are talking about whether we wish to live in a neighborhood defined by mutual respect and rule of law, or one defined by coercion and the raw exercise of power. The bigger target that Eric Ham speaks of is not just on the Canadian economy, it is on the very idea of Canada as a free and independent nation. And that is a target that no American who believes in liberty should ever wish to see painted. The mechanics of this developing crisis are rooted in the accumulation of executive power here in Washington. We have allowed the presidency to grow into a leviathan, capable of imposing tariffs and upending treaties with little oversight from the legislative branch. This institutional decay at home is what enables the adventurism abroad. The economic force threatening Canada is a byproduct of a domestic constitutional failure, the failure of Congress to check the executive's impulse to govern by decree. When the president can unilaterally decide to punish an ally with crippling economic measures or toy with the sovereignty of a neighbor as a negotiating tactic, we see the consequences of our own institutional negligence. The looming renegotiation of CUSMA in 2026 is the flashpoint, the moment where these abstract trends will collide with hard reality. But the groundwork is being laid now in the rhetoric of 51 first state ambitions and the aggressive posturing we see in Venezuela and beyond. As we look ahead to how this will unfold, we must understand the specific levers being pulled. The administration is banking on the assumption that Canada is vulnerable, that its reliance on the U.S. market is a fatal weakness that can be exploited to force political integration. This is a cynical gamble. It assumes that prosperity is the only value that matters to a people, ignoring the deep reservoirs of patriotism and history that define the Canadian experience. In the next segment of our discussion, we will walk through the specific machinery of this pressure campaign, how the trade negotiations, the tariffs, and the diplomatic snubs are choreographed to isolate Ottawa. We will examine the incentives driving this policy and the dangerous precedents it sets. But for now, let it be understood what is happening is not normal statecraft. It is a deviation from the norms of the Anglosphere, a rupture in the family of English-speaking democracies, and a perilous step into the unknown. The target on Canada is real, and the weapon is a corrupted vision of American greatness that equates dominance with strength. To understand the precise nature of the threat now facing our northern neighbor, we must look closely at the instrument of coercion being sharpened in Washington, the renegotiation of the trade agreement known as CUSMA. In the lexicon of modern bureaucracy, CUSMA, the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement sounds dry, a mere technical successor to NAFTA. But for the millions of citizens whose livelihoods depend on the integrated North American economy, it is the essential architecture of their daily lives. It provides the rules of the road for a continent-wide market, ensuring that goods, services, and energy flow with a predictability that allows businesses to invest and families to plan. Yet as we look toward the looming negotiations in 2026, the administration has made it clear that this architecture is considered disposable. The president has signaled not merely a desire to tweak the terms, but a willingness, perhaps even an eagerness, to walk away from the deal entirely. This is not the brinkmanship of a hard-nosed negotiator looking for a decimal point advantage on dairy tariffs. It is the calculated destabilization of an entire economic ecosystem. The official line emerging from the White House, echoed by the United States Trade Representative during public meetings, is that Canada has been giving the United States a raw deal. This assertion persists despite the chorus of industry leaders, academics, and policy experts who have sung the praises of the agreement as a mutually beneficial framework. The administration's narrative is immune to this evidence because its grievance is not rooted in economics, but in a profound dissatisfaction with the existence of a peer on its border. The president's rhetoric suggests that any arrangement in which Canada retains its full sovereignty and prosperity is by definition unfair to the United States. This zero-sum thinking transforms a partner into a parasite in the eyes of the electorate, justifying measures that would otherwise be unthinkable between allies. We are seeing a deliberate attempt to frame Canada not as a friend to be cooperated with, but as an obstacle to be removed or absorbed. This diplomatic aggression does not exist in a vacuum. It is amplified by a series of military and geopolitical maneuvers that provide a disquing context for the trade talks. We have seen reports of American tankers off the coast of Venezuela, missile strikes in Nigeria, and the appointment of a special envoy tasked with negotiating the acquisition of Greenland. These are the actions of an administration operating on the belief that territory and resources are there for the taking, provided one has the requisite audacity and firepower. When you view the Canadian situation through this lens, the bigger target that analyst Eric Ham warns of comes into sharp focus: the ambition to bring Canada under U.S. sovereignty, a notion that was once the stuff of 19th century manifesto or satirical fiction, has been revived as a serious policy objective. The president has explicitly mentioned using economic force to achieve this aim. The logic is simple and brutal: weaken the Canadian economy through tariffs and uncertainty until political union with the United States becomes the only lifeline. For the average viewer dealing with the realities of a cooling economy, rising inflation, and stubborn unemployment figures, this might sound like a distant geopolitical game. You might ask why the sovereignty of Canada should matter when the price of groceries in Ohio or the job market in Michigan is of more immediate concern. But the connection is direct and perilous. The economic implications of shattering the North American trade bloc are enormous, not just for Ottawa, but for the United States as well. Disruption of this magnitude does not create jobs. It destroys supply chains. It does not lower prices. It invites retaliatory measures and market volatility. Furthermore, the moral cost of transforming our republic into an expansionist power is a price paid in the currency of our national soul. We are flirting with the idea that our own economic malaise can be cured by cannibalizing a neighbor, a desperate and dangerous delusion that history warns us against. The backdrop to this unfolding drama involves a systematic dismantling of the guardrails that once protected our alliances. We must recall that Canada is the only G7 nation that does not have a free trade agreement with the United States outside of CUSMA. This leaves them uniquely vulnerable to the expiration or abrogation of that deal. The administration is well aware of this leverage. By isolating Canada, by refusing to engage in the standard diplomatic niceties that have characterized the last century of friendship, the White House is testing a hypothesis that raw power applied without apology can redraw the map of North America. This is the political landmine that awaits us next year. It is a crisis manufactured by choice, driven by an ideology that views the independence of others as an affront to American greatness. As we peel back the layers of this strategy, we see that the tools being used, tariffs, rhetoric, and the threat of abandonment, are designed to break the will of a sovereign people. The build-up to this moment has been gradual, normalizing the abnormal until the unthinkable becomes policy. We have become desensitized to the language of acquisition, to the idea that a country like Greenland or Canada is merely a distressed asset awaiting a hostile takeover. But we must not lose our capacity for shock. The raw deal narrative is a smoke OKC screen. The reality is that the administration is engaging in a form of imperial coercion that has no place in the relations between free democracies. It is a betrayal of the stability that generations of Americans and Canadians fought to preserve. And, as we will see, the mechanics of how this pressure is applied reveal a disturbing centralization of power in the hands of one man, bypassing the checks and balances that were designed to prevent exactly this kind of capricious foreign policy. The upcoming midterm elections and the trade negotiations are on a collision course, and the collateral damage will be the trust and friendship of our oldest ally. Let us examine the machinery of this coercion. How does a democracy transform itself into a predator? It begins by redefining the nature of leverage. In a normal diplomatic universe, trade agreements are contracts of mutual benefit arrived at through the tedious but necessary friction of negotiation. In the current paradigm, however, trade is viewed through a mercantilist lens where one nation's surplus is another's defeat, and where economic dependency is a vulnerability to be exploited rather than a tie that binds. The administration has operationalized this worldview by turning the American consumer market, the single most powerful economic engine in human history, into a siege weapon. The strategy is not subtle. It relies on the raw application of pain or the credible threat thereof to force capitulation. When the president speaks of economic force, he is describing a mechanism of statecraft raft that treats a friendly neighbor with the same tactical ruthlessness one might apply to a rogue state under sanctions. Consider the signals being sent from the periphery to the center. The appointment of a special envoy to negotiate the acquisition of Greenland is not a diplomatic curiosity. It is a declaration of intent. It establishes a bureaucratic structure for territorial expansion, legitimizing the idea that sovereign nations can be bought if the price is right or the pressure is sufficient. This is the context in which Ottawa must view its own position if the United States is willing to engage in such overt maneuverings regarding Greenland. Dismissing the talk of absorbing Canada as mere bluster becomes an act of willful blindness. The military posturing we observe elsewhere, the missile strikes in Nigeria, the naval presence off Venezuela, serves to underline this point. These are not random acts. They are demonstrations of a unilateralist resolve that brushes aside international norms. They signal to Canada that the United States is in a mood to take what it wants and that the niceties of the G7 club are of little consequence to a White House focused on the art of the deal. The lever being pulled most aggressively is the tariff. For this administration, tariffs are not merely a policy preference, they are a theology. Despite the consensus of economists that such levies function as taxes on domestic consumers and act as sand in the gears of global commerce, the president views them as a really good thing. They are the kudel used to soften up the other side. By threatening to impose debilitating tariffs on Canadian goods or by allowing the existing customer protections to lapse, the administration aims to create a climate of economic panic north of the border. The goal is to induce a recessionary spiral in Canada that makes the stability of political union with the United States, the 51st state solution, appear not as a surrender but as a rescue. It is a strategy of immiseration designed to pave the way for integration predicated on the belief that Canada can be weakened enough to be overtaken. We must also recognize the specific vulnerability that has been engineered here. As the analysis suggests, Canada stands as the only G7 nation without a free trade agreement with the United States separate from the QSMA framework. This is not an accident, it is a tactical encirclement. By ensuring that there is no fallback position, no safety net of alternative treaties, the administration has placed Canada in a precarious position where the collapse of CUSMA means the collapse of their privileged access to the American economy. This leverage is maximized by the administration's US versus the world posture, a solitary stance that rejects the multilateral web of alliances in favor of bilateral tests of strength. The isolation of Canada is a deliberate feature of the mechanics, a way to ensure that when the squeeze is applied, there are no other friends in the room to intervene. The human agents of this policy, the trade representatives, the envoys, the political strategists, are operating under a directive that prizes disruption over continuity. They are tasked with finding the fracture points in the Canadian Confederation and pressing down. We see this in the rhetoric that separates the Canadian people from their government, implying that the citizens are victims of a raw deal brokered by their own leaders, and that Washington offers a better alternative. This is the language of subversion. It attacks the legitimacy of a neighbor's democracy in order to weaken its negotiating hand. When we look at the mechanism as a whole, the tariffs, the military signaling, the diplomatic isolation, and the overt questioning of sovereignty, we see a machine built for one purpose: to erase the border, not through the brotherhood of nations, but through the absorption of the weaker by the stronger. It is a mechanism that, once switched on, may be impossible to switch off without catastrophic damage to the fabric of North American life. We must ultimately ask who bears the responsibility for this descent into neighborhood bullying. While the impulse may originate from the Oval Office, the machinery is manned by a cadre of enablers, trade representatives, envoys, and strategists who have chosen to interpret the silence of the legislative branch as a license for excess. They are operating on the gamble that the American public is too distracted by the carnival of domestic politics to notice that the fundamental pillars of our foreign policy are being sawed through. Yet there remains one institutional check that may yet play a decisive role in this unfolding drama. As we look toward 2026, the Supreme Court is expected to rule once again on the scope of executive tariff powers. This decision will be the fulcrum upon which the future of the North American economy turns. It will determine whether the power to levy taxes on our neighbors remains a tool of presidential whim, a weapon to be brandished in search of a better deal, or whether it returns to its constitutional home in the Congress, subject to the deliberation and debate that such consequential actions demand. If the court affirms the executive's unchecked authority, the path is cleared for the administration to escalate its pressure campaign against Canada without hindrance. But if the judiciary reasserts the separation of powers, it could snap the rod of coercion that the White House is currently wielding. This is the institutional cliffhanger of our time, a collision between an expansionist executive and the parchment barriers of the Constitution. However, we cannot rely solely on the courts to save us from our own worst instincts. The damage being done to the fabric of friendship between our two nations may prove irreversible long before a gavel strikes in Washington. The human cost of this policy is often obscured by the dry language of quotas and boundary disputes, but it is real and it is profound. We are not just talking about the disruption of supply chains, we are talking about the disruption of lives. The Canadian worker in the automotive plant in Ontario, whose livelihood hangs in the balance of a tweet from Washington. The American farmer in the Midwest who relies on open markets to sell his harvest. The families that span the border for whom the undefended line is a symbol of shared heritage. These are the casualties of a worldview that treats allies as acquisitions. By aggressively posturing that Canada is merely a bigger target for absorption, we are dehumanizing a neighbor. We are telling a proud people that their history, their culture, and their distinct democratic tradition are irrelevant in the face of American power. This is an affront not just to their sovereignty, but to their dignity. There is a tragic irony in the fact that while we busy ourselves with missile strikes in Nigeria and the fantasy of buying Greenland, we are actively dismantling the most successful example of peaceful coexistence the world has ever known. The 51st state conversation, whether intended as a negotiating tactic or a genuine ambition, is a poison in the well. It breeds a resentment that will outlast any administration. It teaches a generation of Canadians that the United States is not a protector of liberty but a threat to it, and it diminishes us in the eyes of the world. If we cannot treat a nation as culturally and economically aligned with us as Canada with basic respect, what hope do we have of leading a complex and fractured world? We are signaling that our friendship is conditional, predatory, and ultimately fleeting. As we conclude this analysis, we must recognize that the target on Canada is in reality a reflection of a target we have placed on ourselves, on our own values, our own institutions, and our own capacity for restraint. The strength of the United States has never rested solely on its ability to conquer or coerce. It has rested on its ability to inspire and to build. By turning on Canada, we are abandoning the builder's trowel for the wrecking ball. The resilience of the Canadian idea of peace, order, and good government is a quiet rebuke to the chaos we are projecting. It is a reminder that there is dignity in stability, and that a neighbor is not a piece of property to be acquired, but a partner to be cherished. The choice before us is stark. We can continue down this path of economic force, treating the map of North America as a risk board where nations are won and lost. Or we can remember the wisdom that built the longest peaceful border in history. True strength is not found in the annexation of others, but in the mastery of oneself. As citizens, as voters, and as neighbors, we must decide if we wish to be a republic that respects its friends or an empire that consumes them. What do you think? Is the pursuit of a better deal worth the cost of our oldest alliance? Or have we lost sight of what actually makes a nation great? I invite you to leave your thoughts in the comments below, to like this video if you believe in the value of understanding these institutional stakes, and to subscribe as we continue to monitor the health of our democracy and the choices made in your name. Until next time, stay engaged and keep thinking.